Okay. Let's repeat everything I said. All right. So looking at the migration components here in the demographic section of the model. So we have immigration, emigration, the change in non-permanent residents, and the net interprovincial flows. So the way these equations work, you're going to get a lot of your initial forecasts going to come from our system because we have a national bottom-up system where we model each province, and that sums to our Canadian totals. So the interprovincial flows are heavily dictated or determined by what comes out of our individual provincial forecasts. And that's, as you can see here, what we're really looking at is the relative tightness in Manitoba's labor market compared to the rest of Canada in this case. So of course, if times are good or better relative to elsewhere in Canada on an average, Manitoba would then start to see migrants attracted into the province because people typically move where the work is located, as we know, and so the model is essentially trying to balance your labor market in times of significant growth, which has always been the case in general historically. So that's essentially how your interprovincial flows are working in this system. The immigration on the international side here. So what we try to do is we balance the aggregate labor market. So much like what interprovincial is doing here at a provincial level, the international migration targets or estimates that come out of our national system are trying to do the same type of thing for Canada as a whole. So when we start to see very tight markets, the model tries to suck in some more people, more international immigrants, of course, here. So it's trying to do the same type of method. That's essentially how these equations work. Obviously, on the immigration front, we also have a lot of policy at play here. So I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the feds came out with some very aggressive immigration targets just at the end of October. And they were looking to bring in about, I think, 410, 420, and 430,000 immigrants for the next 3 years for 21, 22, 23. The problem with that is we have very high unemployment rates in this country. So there's a lot of people certainly don't believe that this number is realistic because there'd be you typically get a lot of political blowback from the population if these people were trying to come in. I mean, I guess the targets, it was a noble gesture in that they're trying to stimulate growth for recovery, particularly in the service industries. But they did, there's a lot of risk to that level that they are trying to target because they do have a variance in that level of 110,000 people per year. And the minimum target or the minimum on that range is actually back at the old 300,000 number per year. So currently our model is coming in or generating numbers closer to the minimum side. So we are still pulling in about 1 million immigrants per year over the next 3 years in our current forecast. It's just that the unemployment rates are hanging so high everywhere in the country that, unless you're going to really impose these numbers in, and it's absolutely going to happen, it's very hard to say, particularly through this COVID situation. The feds have said that they have all these giant stack of applications all ready to go. They just got to process them and bring these people in. But there's still restrictions on international travelers. There's the self-isolation protocols in some places. So I think there's going to be some challenges there trying to get over 400,000 people per year currently. But so that is a major risk to the current outlook that we are generating that I just want to make you guys aware of right now. But again, we are thinking that it would be very hard to get those levels, and particularly for the residential market, because we work with the Canadian Home Builders Association, and from what I've heard is we can't build more than 210,000 units per year. So if you're bringing in that type of population, that type of immigration, you're going to need levels up there or higher than that. So it would cause chaos in the residential markets, and that varies, of course, by province. But it's just something to think about there as well. You can't just always do whatever you want. You know, there are limits, and some resources are scarce, particularly in the construction industry, to try and house all those people. So anyways, that's essentially how these equations work. You're looking at relative labor market tightness that would then draw in population as needed. So moving down here, of course, we have the births. So we work with the fertility probability data provided by StatsCan on the births by age of mother here. So we're looking at ages 15 all the way to, we assume that up to 49. So we're assuming that people over 50 and over are not having babies in this system. On the population side, so as I mentioned, we are working with an age cohort survival approach system here. And this is a single year of age population model here, looking at the females. So you have your births and the probability of female births. So that's really just your share of females. You have your net migration share. We do both international migration shares. So this is our age structured migration, and then the interprovincial component as well. And then as you become older, of course, then you start applying mortality probabilities, and which is this here. So you have the survivor approach on last year's 0-year-olds, and then you have your migration components as well. And so people just move through the system aging, and some moving in and out of the province, all these factors coming into play here to develop your female population estimates by age, single year of age, all the way up to the age 90 and over. And then we do identical equations for the males. Then a lot of identity equations here, because we're just looking at the summation of these single year ages into their 5 and 10 year age groups, just for running some equations and for viewing for other purposes, things like that. So I should mention as well, within our modeling system, of course, you have two different types of equations. I didn't talk about this yet. Stochastic equations, and if you remember your econometrics courses and so forth, the stochastic equations are essentially equations that have errors in them, right? So there will always be an error term. They're typically estimated equations, whereas identity equations are ones that would just sum up, generally have 0 errors. So when we update our modeling system for you guys, we do residual checks, and obviously one of the checks is that all identity equations are summing to 0, having 0 residual in them. And on the stochastic side, to help fit some of the equations, we're looking to make sure that the errors are not as that significant, I guess. So we're getting decent estimates historically with our stochastic equations, except in the case of investment, that is, because there is no such thing as an investment equation that can work perfectly. You can have incredible swings in the levels of investment for all kinds of reasons, largely related to sentiment. So exactly why we talk about animal spirits in that case. So just some more age groups here, getting the source population age 15 and over and so forth, looking at older ages 65 and over. So we need all these components to drive, some of the current spending on education and health, that type of stuff, and we'll get into that more when we get to the industry side of the model. And then here, of course, we just are adding up the females and males population to get you your total. On the death side, we have a similar setup here. So we basically are just taking the difference in these equations to compute total deaths. We have an aggregate fertility rate, which is weighted by the population here. Then again, on the households, so the households I showed you earlier, driving the residential side here. So we're working with headship rates. So these are computed out of the census, applying those headship rates. So that's basically people per household, number of people living in a house times the population for that age group. So you can get your aggregate number of household estimates. We then would sum them up. But we're also, because we're dealing with a structural type of residential model, we're also estimating the households by structural type. So you can actually, you can view these in our residential table. I'll show you some of this. This Invest Res 2 here. So the top component of the table is all the starts numbers. We then look at the formations levels as well. Of course, there are relatively, this was much more of a problem. David and I were talking about this before the break, how the 2011 census was just not helping at all on the headship rates, because there was such a change in the unit types that people were living in, and that's because the market has just gone crazy with affordability problems and so forth. So you get significant differences, for example, in say we were to look at the number of apartments here relative to the apartment estimate. Actually, Manitoba is not that big of a problem. They're looking quite good in this case. But in some provinces, you get situations where the level of starts don't so much follow the formation estimates, and we've calibrated this somewhat, and I'll show you that in the EX2 macro, and that's because we want to make assumptions about what proportion of housing starts are going to be each unit type, and that's factoring in affordability concerns and all that kind of stuff. So when you look at this table, you can see we have a lot larger breakdown here on the formation estimates relative to the 4 unit types up above here. So we are looking at the semis, the rows, but if you're familiar with the data from StatCan on in the census, sorry, on the formation numbers, you get a breakdown of apartments by all kinds of different types here as well. So these groupings down here are summed up to get your aggregate apartment measure. But we still like to see what the big push is for here. Is it a high rise, low rise, all that kind of stuff. So all that information is contained in here as well. And then we also have the residential investment at the bottom. So that's all this is. We're basically taking household numbers, applying headship rates to them to get your household by type estimates. And then we also have an owner occupied share, the DHHO component, and this is a similar situation where you're just taking the owner shares rather than the aggregate shares in this case. So we have these in the model as well if you're interested in looking at those. So moving down here. So this component now we call the weighted population for health expenditures. Now we use this DPHS variable to help drive the current spending on health for the health sector in the province. And what you're seeing here, these are basically costs. I can't remember if they're in millions or they're just weighted. These are weighted to the age structure. So this information comes from CIHI, the Canadian Institute for Health Information. And, they basically look at clearly hospital costs increase dramatically for the oldest age groups. So obviously you're going to see weights here for the 90-year-olds and over being the highest, and they fall. So of course, as you age, you put significantly higher costs on the health service system, on the health system. So that's really what this is doing. It takes your population age structure, applies health expenditure cost weights to them, and we come up with an aggregate, what we call the weighted population for health expenditures. So of course, as the province ages, you get a larger share of the population in the higher age groups. You start to see this number that represented in the growth of the DPHS variable here. So on the education side, we also try to do something like that. But what we're dealing with here is actually the participation rates in education. So which share of these ages are attending, elementary school, high schools, and also going into universities. So we have 2 of these measures, one for the provincial government and one for the municipal government, which we call local, DPESL, versus DPESP. And of course, you notice that the provincial government is responsible for the more university age stuff. So here we're looking at 18 to 29-year-olds in this equation, whereas for the local side of things, where you're dealing with your elementary and your primary and secondary school age groups instead. So that these are trying to represent basically the weight there to help drive education costs.
I had a question actually for, with the both health expenditures and the education. This is a combination of public and private spending, right?
Correct.
Is there any way to does your model separate that? Because that has came up in question a few times.
I bet we can't do that, unfortunately. They just don't provide that breakdown.
Okay.
And you know, we have the same challenges when we're tuning the government capital plans and you know, all that kind of stuff as well, right?
It's like comparing apples to oranges, and yeah, it would be nice to have that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what we try. Sorry, go ahead.
It's a good point, because it's good to know that it's combining private and public.
Yeah.
Because as we dissect the outcome of this, those questions come up, right? So, especially within this government.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd drop that now. That's all. Because yeah.
That's a good point. What we do try to do, though, because of that issue, I mean, certainly if you try to compare public accounts to the fixed capital stocks and flows data, you'll notice the levels are way off as well. The health isn't so bad because the provincial government's, you know, 100% responsible for it typically, but there is, of course, you know, care homes for elderly and stuff like that included in there. But generally, you get pretty reasonable representation on health investment compared to the FKSF. But because of these differences, as you say there, David, and having the private component in there, when we do our budget analysis or whatever we can get out of that you guys publish, we look at the first difference in the level of spending rather than percent changes or anything like that. So we want to know 300 million increase in education spending. We don't want to know 5% change, that kind of stuff. So we are trying to do our best to account for those differences as well. And let's show you that when we look at the investment tuning a bit. Okay, so moving into the labor market next. This is easier if that was on that line. Of course, total employment is a summation of our 14 sectors. That's the extent of the employment modeling that we're doing here. We also have to factor in the hours component to this, and that's really to get with the payroll and labor income estimates to improve that. So we're looking at the average weekly hours here in this case that we get from the, I think from the CEF survey. Again, on labor force, of course, defined by the participation rate times your source population. And there you can see why we have the population age groups driving your LP, which is your source pop, ages 15 and over, who aren't incarcerated or institutionalized, I guess.
I think your hours are probably from labor force, because I think CEF is just, doesn't include self-employed.
Right, sorry, yes, that's true. Yeah, I haven't updated. My staff update these numbers now, so not as in touch with the data. Okay, so what else we got? Source pop, labor force, of course, your weighted participation rate. So here, so what we do with the part rates, of course, we have all the historical data, but then as we go forward, we try to chart these participation by gender and by 10-year age group in this case, and make assumptions about where they're going to be going over the next several years. So of course we've seen, you know, for example, female participation rates have come up significantly, and more so in certain age groups than others in the past decade, in the past 20 years, however long. And whereas the males have been relatively stable for a lot of this stuff. So, you know, and then we're also seeing, of course, in the older age groups, the 65 and over age, for both females and males, they've been coming up because people just are living longer and aren't retiring as early these days. So we basically chart these looking at the trend historically. We then try to set sort of midpoints as we go into the forecast period. So maybe we would set one point in, say, 2023, and then 2028, and then possibly flatten it out thereafter, depending. It really depends on where the trend has been moving. And then we would interpolate in between those numbers to really get some participation rate trend. So if I maybe show you some of these. It's the females here. go back in history. So there's an example of your part rate for ages 55 to 64 in the females, right? So our last value, I believe should have been 19 in this case, but you can see what we're trying to do here. So we assume that there may still be some upward potential. So we look at these every year and try to make some assumptions about where these could possibly be going, rather than just flatlining them into the forecast period. So these type of things are built into our current model, and we are looking at them pretty carefully every year, because we do a lot of stuff on the occupational side, occupation modeling and so forth, if you're familiar with some other side of our business that we do. So that is included in here, and something to think about when you're looking at the aggregate participation rate and where it's going over the next 10 years at the very least. So again, just some other identity definitions here: unemployment, the level, and the rate. Okay, so moving into labor costs now, and we'll get into the price side of the model and some of the tax information here. So we have, again, for the payroll accounting components, we have the average hourly wages. What else do we have? The annual labor income per employee. So this will be in, maybe $58,000 per year or something like that. And then the payroll tax rates. So just putting in your contributions to EI, your CPP contributions, that'd be like the employer's share. And then again, what's happening on this is your labor income. So you can take a look at these equations if you're not familiar with the whole wage system. We also have the user cost aspect of this model. So these typically are used to drive not only the cost index, cost functions, which I'll show you next, but also looking at the investment. So here we have things like the user cost of capital, because we want to get relative labor costs versus capital costs. So these are all built into the system, and you have all kinds of things built into these, like tax rates, subsidies, investment tax credits, the capital cost allowances, a lot of stuff in here. I'm not going to go into detail in them right now. You can dissect them at a later time if you're interested, but they are all in here, and we're trying to differentiate them for the user cost of machinery and equipment in this case, so the ME, and the non-residential construction side of things. So they are differentiated in that way, and that's because you have different tax rates for different components of investment. We also try to do them, in this case, I should say, on what we call on the manufacturers versus non-manufacturers. But at the federal level, there's no difference in manufacturing versus non-manufacturing corporate tax rates right now. So these are actually identical. This equation gives you the same answer as that equation. But what we do is, of course, we apply this one to the manufacturing cost equation, and the non-manufacturing is applied to every other industry in the model. So, but the point is that the differentiation is there if there were a difference in tax rates, or if the feds did try to provide some type of manufacturing rate changes in that case. We then have our aggregate cost function. So here we're looking at the user cost data. So we can get this from StatCan. Then we have what we call, of course, the labor share. So this is your labor share relative to capital, and that would come out of the input-output tables. And here you're looking at a moving average of the growth rate in your hourly wage rate times the labor share. So that gives you your labor component, 1 minus the labor share, and then you're differentiating the capital into machinery and equipment and into the construction component. So this is really giving you your aggregate industry costs for both labor and capital as a whole. We then have our relative labor costs. So as you know, a lot of the cycles that are generated in this model come from changes in relative costs, and that says the economy shifts back and forth. When you get higher costs of capital, you tend to hire more laborers, and vice versa. When things go the other way and the labor market becomes too tight and you start seeing wage inflation, then firms start substituting in for more capital. So that's done through these relative cost of capital versus the relative labor cost, and that by industry. So again, taking different accounting for differences in the labor share versus capital earnings on GDP by sector, and then again using the same type of concepts where we're looking at machinery and equipment versus non-residential construction here, and then again wages for labor side. So. So these all get into the RLCs get into your productivity equations by industry, labor productivity, and these get in the relative cost of capital, of course, is built into the investment equations by industry. Okay, into the price sector here. So we have our aggregate GDP deflator, we call PGDP. Of course, just your nominal over your real. We also have a bunch of other prices here. So in this case, on the natural gas price, we put a CA on it to make it a Canadian price. We're taking the US Henry Hub price of gas and then converting it into Canadian dollars. So the exchange rate is incorporated in all of these equations. You then have a local component on the price of natural gas. So where that takes the Canadian rate, and then we have a carbon tax model built into the system as well. So these are the tax rate on carbon taxes at the federal level, and then you have a coverage ratio, and then you can also have a tax rate on carbon at the provincial level. So we put in both those options because obviously we had a lot of flip-flopping and different things going on across the country, whether it was a provincially regulated system or we had the blanket federal backstop applied to the rate in general. So this basically allows you to either turn one or the other on, or however you need to do it, of course, in this case. And you get your carbon tax component built on top of that sort of national measure, we would say in this case. We're just you call it sort of a dummy variable. On oil, same thing if we have here. So we're I guess using the WTI US price as the benchmark because what we're really interested in here is percent changes, not so much in the level in how this works. So typical, same concept though, converting it into Canadian dollars, because of course that's what matters to local cost functions. We have coal in here as well. It shouldn't be as important, but I think you guys still have one coal-fired plant, don't you? Maybe in Winnipeg.
No, it was phased out.
It was phased out. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I did know about it though. Okay. Also, then again, on the petroleum and coal products. So here we're looking more at refined fuels, that type of stuff. Any refinery products, and again, they have the carbon taxes all built into these equations as well. So these coefficients you see here, these are the amount of carbon produced per unit of measure in this case, whether that be a kiloton of coal, a million BTUs of natural gas, or a barrel of oil in this case. And then again, the electric power price is in here for the province, the PPI ELP, the producer price index, we call it. That's what these PPIs stand for. Again, but we're overriding. We are actually shutting this equation off in the solution period, and I'll show you that because we do have the growth information from Manitoba Hydro about the intended rate increases over the next several years. Okay.
Sorry, Eric, can I ask a quick question?
Of course, anytime.
So for natural gas and oil, obviously you have the current and historical prices, but what do you do about future prices? Like, where are you drawing that information from?
Okay. Well, a lot of the stuff we try to get out of professional forecasting systems. The EIA has been a pretty standard source for us in the past few years. So on oil prices, we typically go with the EIA. I look at a range of forecasts on natural gas as well. But again, largely sourced from the EIA. You know, they have their short-term energy outlook, and they publish that every 3 weeks. So that'll give you the next 2 years, the current year and the next 2 years. And then annually, they publish their annual energy outlook in January. So that'll give us sort of our longer-term outlook. And I think they're probably, other than the International Energy Agency in France, those are really the two big long-term energy price forecasters in the world right now. So we try to source our information from those guys. But I also like to throw in any assumptions if their stuff's off from what I see. So we also check, you know, we're very much into the energy markets as well. We look at a lot of the forecasts coming out of firms in Calgary and looking at Canadian prices. You know, things like WCS is more important in our Alberta model, and price differentials on that type of stuff. But we are just making sure we have the best and most current information available when we produce our forecasts. But it's a limited supply of sources when you get into the longer term outlook, though, for that stuff. Okay, these industry cost equations can be they're gigantic and they're blinding a little bit. We actually had to because of the size of them, we had to turn them into 2 equations per industry. So this is equation 1 for agriculture, and that's equation 2, because forecast gear wasn't set up to deal with with the number of characters per equation. They were just getting to be too big. So what these really are, they're essentially the input-output framework. If you're familiar with how the domestic sales equations work, or how an input-output model works, you're looking at how, on the domestic sales equations, you're looking at how much does every other industry demand of your industry. So that's what the coefficients are. But if you invert the matrix, then you get how much, what is my cost exposure, or what is my exposure, how much, what inputs, what share of my inputs are demanded from another industry, right? So in the case of, that's essentially what these coefficients are. So they're looking at what is your cost exposure to every other sector in the economy. So that's basically how we do this. We've also factored in here all kinds of other stuff, such as energy usage. So we take the final demand tables. So these, I'll show you these when we get to the industry block, but we have, this is basically the input share of oil used in a unit of production for the agriculture industry. Again, and then we have all these other ones. So that's right, WCS, natural gas, coal. So we call them IO shares. So that it's basically what percentage do you use. Now, this is incredibly important for driving the cost model for certain sectors. Again, when you get to the heavy, high intensity energy using sectors, such as chemicals, primary metals, cement, things like that, where there's just a ton of energy inputs required to produce a unit of output. So that way we can at least account for changes in these energy prices and how they're going to have an impact on a sector's cost, of course. And then other than that, we're also factoring in all kinds of components here. So we have the raw material price index for other mining. So, you know, raw materials, mined materials. We have the electric power price, which share of your input is electricity in your production process. And then we also, every industry has their cost index exposure to the other industries. So these can feed off each other somewhat, is the idea, right? So if you start seeing energy prices going up dramatically, you're going to start to see prices rising, costs rising in every sector, and those costs in turn will then be passed on to the other sectors, and so on and so on. So if you look at these equations in detail, you'll start to see how this kind of thing works. On top of the cost components, we also try to get in all the raw material prices in this stuff too. So we have the producer price index for wood products. We have paper. We have the petroleum and coal for the refined components. What else do we have in here? I think that's all. And these equations do differ. So whether you're, obviously, if you have zero inputs of a sector, that part of the equation won't even be in here. We erase it. So I think we've only put these to 9 decimal places. So if you use less than 0.000001 in your inputs percentage of an industry's outputs, then it doesn't even show up here because it's relatively insignificant. So that's what these cost equations try to do. And again, because they're so large and there's so many industries in this model, we've broken it into 2. So then we sum them up here, take a moving average of them so that we don't get an immediate, the assumption basically being that the producers will eventually pass their costs on to consumers, but it may not get 100% pass through in the first year here. So that's really how this works. So you get a repeat, sort of repetitive equation for every sector.
Sorry, Aaron, can I just ask a quick question on that there?
Yes, of course.
If the assumption is that firms are passing through those any additional costs, how does it work for in industries that compete in international markets and have, lesser ability to pass on those costs?
Right. You can make assumptions about that stuff. This is really to get representative flavor in your local domestic costs versus a producer price or expectations of price changes for commodities. So the point is ultimately, and it's really more about when you're conducting shocks on the model, right? If you start changing energy prices and things like that, then you want to see more imports and less exports in that case for most sectors, right? Because they're getting more higher cost pressures. So that's really how these equations work. On a whole, though, as we go through the individual industry tuning, we're just looking at the sectors in detail. So we end up overriding or just making our general assumptions about where sectors are going over the next few years, because this is a calibrated model. So, but theoretically, this is really just trying to capture some of that component. So you would lose some market share if your costs were, rising very rapidly, kind of thing. I hope that answers your question a bit. But again, you're right. Some sectors certainly can't pass all their costs on. Ultimately, you would have to, otherwise you just wouldn't survive in many cases. But what will happen as we get into the industry equations, I can show you this, you start to see the exports sort of degrade, right? And we'll get to that once we get down to an industry block. Okay, so this is a big part of the model, just goes on and on and on here. Same concept for every sector. So we get to the final demand prices now. Okay, so here obviously we're just talking about the GDE components. Of course, so you have your consumer price deflators. Here we put the CPI with its basket weights on the various consumer spending types. We have expected price inflation. So this is where I was showing you the real interest rate expectation. So it was always the short-term interest rate less the PEMN, which is really just a moving average on the aggregate consumer price deflator. So as we go down here, you start seeing these cost index equations showing up as well. And here we're accounting for import shares on these final demand prices, because we want to have a localized cost, and we also want to have the global price factored in here. So here we're looking at the different, so for example, in the case of chemical products, you'll have your local cost, and then you'll have your producer price index, so your global price, excluding that local cost, so the differential, and that will be weighted by its import share of that sector's inputs. So you see the same structure over and over and over again in these equations to make use of that cost model to drive the final demand prices in this system. And what this is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, it's called a stage of processing price model. So what you're looking at here is the raw material prices drive secondary prices, the intermediate prices, and the intermediate prices are ultimately passed on to the final demand prices. So that's the stage of processing that is built into this this type of model on pricing. So we do this type of stuff for all components of all GDE components, so that we can compute the nominal numbers that you were seeing in each of those sections up on the demand side of the model here. So again, durables, non-durables, semi-durables in your services and all that, even imputed rent and so forth. So I won't look at them forever. We'll be here all day otherwise. Again, same type of concepts. We get into the investment, price deflators, all final demand components are included here, and so on and so on. And then the government price deflators and some more of the investment ones. And then we have our aggregate final domestic demand deflator. And then we get into our export deflator. So here we're looking at real exports for a specific industry. So here's agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting and fishing, hunting and trapping, not forestry because it's right here. Applying that to the raw material price index for agriculture products. We apply the wood products raw material price index to the forestry, of course, gas to the oil and gas sector. We have the metals and minerals index being applied to the other mining. Food, of course, to food, wood, your paper prices, your petroleum and coal, chemicals, other chemicals, and so on and so on. So all this stuff historically comes from Statistics Canada. We then are driving a lot of these prices in our Canadian system, and we get a lot of these commodity price forecasts come from the World Bank, generally speaking. Again, the energy prices will come from other sources such as the EIA and that type of stuff. But a lot of World Bank commodity price index or commodity forecasts being used in these assumptions for all these individual prices. So of course, these all sum up to give you your aggregate export deflator price. We also factor in the trade weighted exchange rate there because we have to convert these. And then we have some other cost components in there as well on user costs and so forth. So you can dissect this sometime if you're interested. And then same type of situation on the import price deflator, where we're just trying to get our exposure, looking at how much we import of a certain commodity or industry commodity and applying it to those prices. Okay. So looking at some of the indirect tax rate stuff. So this will all be, you probably want to look at this more, Thomas, when you're interested in trying to do some of this analysis on tax changes. And we can talk a bit about this tomorrow, but I'll just mention the gist of it now because there are limitations, certainly. For example, not having access to secret data. So our indirect taxes are relatively limited here. Basically, the model for direct tax rate changes. You have your provincial sales tax, you have your GST, you have your carbon taxes. Those are the ones we can absolutely change and model directly, but there are other taxes in there as well on the indirect taxes, such as your education tax, maybe gas and liquor taxes, things like that, where we can't really model that directly. We can certainly do something about that as a specialized project, but you need to know your tax base. And that kind of information is something that we don't have access to, but I'm sure you guys do. So we have done that type of stuff for the Alberta government in the past. where they will go in and they'll get their sales of beer and wine and spirits, for example, if they wanted to do some assumptions about liquor tax changes or that kind of a thing. But you need to know what the sales are to run any type of equations on it. And then of course you need to know what is the taxable proportion. Is 100% of that being taxed? Is it being taxed at different rates? Is beer taxed differently than wine? That kind of stuff. So that's the type of things that really only the finance departments have when you're modeling those types of tax impacts. But you guys should maybe have access to that information. I'm not quite sure. But it's something you can always explore down the road if you want to get into that type of detail. Generally speaking, though, we would, if that work has been researched and done on your side of things, we can make adjustments to the effective tax rates and so forth, and also the taxable proportions for these different final demand components to try and get better representation in these models. So it's a complicated process when you start going into the real sort of low-level tax detail type stuff. So moving ahead. All right, so moving into the income sector now. Of course, aggregate nominal GDP is a summation of all those price deflators being applied to the real economic outlook for all these indicators. Then you get your aggregate nominal GDP. These are basically just, of course, accounting identities, a lot of this stuff. Net domestic income, your GDP list your consumption of fixed capital and your taxes less subsidies. Yeah, there's not too much to say about this section. The labor income, of course, is so we're dealing with one wage rate. So this is your average annual earnings. So let's again assume that's about $58,000 per person. Times the number of employed in the province, and you get your labor income estimates. So those types of things are built here. Your net operating surplus for businesses. So we're talking about corporate profits here. Again, these are just identity equations right out of the economic accounts, if you're familiar with them. And other components of income. So you have your non-farm and your farm income, and I think this is your rental income. We have the new definition of primary income, which took over the personal income definition from back in the day. And I believe that just includes your transfers and so forth from the governments. Transfers received and transfers paid.
There's like a pension adjustment as well.
Right.
New
Yeah.
definition, yeah.
That's right.
It's the big one.
Yeah, that's right. That falls under the transfers, I believe. What else do we have here? So we break this down. We do the farm and non-farm component. It was more for Saskatchewan, where that was a much more significant factor for their model, but it is included here for everybody. Rental income, is running off of things like this is your residential construction, your stock of residential capital, things like that. On the farm side, of course, you can see the ag prices in here, the raw material price index for agriculture, an exchange rate, and then again looking at real output and GDP, so driving these types of things. So all kinds of drivers here. So you guys ever have any questions about what's in these equations, just please shoot us an email. What else is relevant here? Of course, property income, you're going to see things like short and long-term interest rates in here. So this is our 3-month T-bill, and here is your 10-year plus Canada, Government Canada bond rates. Property income paid, transfer payments received. So we had fun with these ones this year with all our CERB payments and so forth. So I don't know if you guys have been looking at any of that stuff, but the feds have been producing data on what they've paid out on a monthly basis. So you can go and extrapolate and come up with some targets for the year and maybe some assumptions about what's going to happen next year. What else we have? So basically all your PEA components on income and stuff here, all your transfer stuff and corporate transfers, government transfers. Yeah, I mean, we typically don't adjust a lot of this stuff over the forecast period, but this all gets into your government accounting tables. If you're trying to do debt modeling and looking at the balance and so forth, then you can play with all this type of stuff. We have all the details built into the system here. Pension entitlements, personal savings, on and on. There's your savings rate, should be going up this year at least. There's our old concept, so we even put old concept in there for you. For personal income, just had your primary income and your transfers received. Wealth measure, and one thing I didn't show you on the consumption equation. So what we try to do is differentiate permanent and transitory income here. So the permanent income, of course, is really just a disposable personal income deflated per capita. So we take an average in that. And then on the transitory side, when you start to see spikes in income gains on a specific year, that could be largely interest rate based and so forth. We're trying to capture that difference here. So you can see we converted a current year disposable personal income number, and then we take the differential from that permanent and call that transitory income. And these actually get into the first equations in this model here. So where's the trans, for example? There you go. So typically we looked at what is statistically significant here, but apparently people are getting transitory income would have differing factors on these separate consumption categories. Of course, this is largely out the window this year, but that is why we are showing these two components here for permanent and transitory income.
I have a double question with your equations here. Do you have like a rule of thumb as to whether you use a D-log versus like the moving average versus any other one? Like, is it
there's no rule of thumb.
Is that or is it just you're trying out different methods and you just it just seems to be tried and true doing a moving average within one case versus running like a D-log in like another set of data?
It depends. It really, you know, I mean, you got to fit them to history, see what works the best. It's really just about that, as most equation fitting is in general, right?
Okay.
There's definitely no rule of thumb. I would say that.
Do these change from year to year? Like
no, they do not. We've never pretty much never touched these things.
Yeah. So your dad would be probably pretty mad if you changed it.
We've had people change it in the past and destroy their model. So okay. You got to be careful.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah,
I don't know anybody in Narendra.
I just have a question, or just a more or less. So when you guys are looking at this stuff, obviously a lot of the inputs of the data come from a couple different sources, but mainly Stats Canada, correct?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
Largely.
So the timing of your forecast, one being in July and then one being in January, is that more out of the inputs that are required for those updates, or is that more to fit some type of business cycle that makes more sense? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We always it took us years to get that down. We figured when do customers really want this stuff is one issue. You know, when are they looking for the new forecasts? The January release was largely to help out with budget planning. You know, most provincial governments are trying to get their budgets ready and they need our numbers in by then. So that was more related to that. And then I think the summer one was just sort of off of a 6 months later type of thing. You know, but you're right. I mean, GDP would come out in April. So by May, you're already forecasting. we're producing internal forecasts between those periods, of course, and continually in some cases. But creating those publications is a significant amount of work. So we try to just keep it every 6 months.
Well, I can only imagine, because the only thing is you're going through this whole exercise here. I was thinking of that too, because the way we did it, we did our preliminary GDP numbers, and it made more sense for budgetary reasons and also the inputs that we could actually get from Statistics Canada at that point in time. So January made sense. And then, like you said, and then in the summer, we typically did a revised GDP number because we got more data, and that was usually around June. So I was just curious from your end of things, but it's sort of aligned with how we were doing it as well.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah, no, it's all about the data release timing. But I mean, even when we're publishing at the end of July, we've been working on it for 6 weeks. So you can call it the August or July forecast, but it could actually be the June, right?
You guys ever have cases where you have an estimate, and then when the national accounts quarterly release comes out, you're like, what the hell are they saying? This is totally conflicting with what we're saying within our model. And then do you have discussions with Statistics Canada or other people?
We don't. Ontario government, some of the provinces, we get special access to their quarterly accounts.
Okay.
But of course, everything's subject to revision. So we've seen that happen before, where we're forced to make the model work a certain way, and then the numbers end up coming back in our direction later.
Yeah, like you guys don't use CapEx data, correct? Spending on non-residential construction and M&E, that comes out in February, but they did like a revised intentions in August.
Oh, so the intention survey, yeah, right.
Yeah, you guys don't even use that.
Not so much. Depends. It depends. I mean, I look at what we do is we collect the monthly building permits data. The intention surveys, they're intentions, right? It's they have misguided in the past many times. So we look at them. I mean, even the FKSF, the most current year that comes out, that's an intention survey, right?
Yeah, you look at them like you look at a Canadian Tire flyer. Comes in the mail, then you put in the recycle bin about 10 seconds later.
There you go. Something like that, yeah.
Good to note. It's definitely good to note. So it's just I'm going to be definitely taking some of your methods, just kind of moving forward.
Yeah. No, I mean a big thing is the monthly building permit data. That's not all telling, of course, because you can apply for a permit way in advance if it's a multi-year project, for example. So that's why the major projects aspect of our modeling really helps, right? Because we're capturing the multi-billion-dollar things typically.
But your model doesn't. You don't use it. Oh, like you don't use any building permits data within the model. I haven't noticed that yet.
No. Just to help our ZI adjustments. Those,
got you.
Tuning, yeah.
The whole.
It helps us with the art part of all.
The art part, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. That's
no problem. Okay. So moving into the government sector now. Always had trouble with this one. You can see we have a needs refinement note here on the Aboriginal revenues. We have never been able to find a good driver for the tax revenue on the Aboriginal stuff. There just isn't really anything out there. But it is, it's the biggest issue with our model, but it is all in here. We do have all levels of government here, the Aboriginals, the local, the provincial, and the federal sectors as we get into here. So both the revenue and expenditure side. Then doing some fixed capital stuff, not that important. So on the Fed side, you have your basically GCGS is your government consumption of goods and services. So we're talking about current spending, and then we sort of generate a per capita growth rate here. So we look at, it's called, if you look at how this works, this is a real per capita growth assumption. So typically governments would try to spend more on a per capita basis over time. So you can see the population component built in here. And of course, in bad times, we see a lot of scaling back on this, if not reducing the per capita numbers. So that's how we're really tuning the current spending components of both the federal, provincial, and local governments. And we can look at that when we get into the model tuning a bit more. On the Fed side, of course, you have your transfers. So you have your old age security, your federal EI, and then your any other one-off emergency transfers, things like that, built in here. So again, we try to tune these somewhat with whatever's announced in the federal budget. And I think these are tuned in our Canadian model, some of them, but you can override them locally is the way we try to set it up within the individual provincial models as well. So we got transfers to business, the provinces, the municipal government transfers, Aboriginal transfers, and then the interest on the debt that they've collected within the province of Manitoba for the feds. On the revenue side, let's see here, you have all your tax components, of course. So this is, all this is the economic account stuff, or the NEFA accounts, I should say. See if there's anything notable here I should bring up for you guys. There's our new carbon tax component. So this is basically a switch. That's your carbon tax rate. Boom. And is this the ECO? This is the actual megatons of CO2 equivalent emissions. So whether there's a rate on or not. Investment income. Anyways, a lot of per capita stuff in here, all kinds of different ways of driving these things. So you can dig in at any time. It's all here for you to look at. Capital consumption allowances. And then on the provincial side, so you have your expenditures. So we're looking at current spending, transfers to persons, transfers to business. I believe that's transfers to the local government from the province, transfers to the feds from the province. That's debt interest payments. Can't remember all these. Your Aboriginal government transfers, and same with non-profit institution transfers or expenditures, and GCTP. What is that? That is our capital transfers. So really, of course, these are all identity equations, as you can see. So they are pretty much defined as is. And then we have all our different spending components. So we do public administrative spending, break the health and social services and the education service spending out as well, because these are what is used to drive the GDP in our ES, HS, and GS industries. As government services, or of course, or government GDP, I should say, is typically all wages and salaries. So these operational spending obviously have a direct linkage to GDP numbers, and is why we break them apart. So, and then you have all your transfers, all kinds of stuff here. And then on the revenue side, so here we got your direct taxes, of course, your income tax. So here we're looking to see things like personal income in here, excluding your EI and CPP contributions, that kind of stuff. Your contributions to your social insurance, direct taxes on business. So we have the corporate tax rates built into here. So in this RTDBP component is basically a weight of the small and large corporation tax rates, as defined by your provincial government. What else we have here? And then of course you're excluding, this is your royalty payments to the government. So we take our corporate profits excluding royalties, and there's your tax rate. So things like that are all factored in here. On the indirect tax side, you'll have your retail sales. Any other, which is where you would find those education taxes and any alcohol and tobacco or gas taxes. And then finally the carbon tax component here. So again, retail sales, looking at all the nominal consumer spending data that comes out of the system to drive your retail sales revenue estimates. We're dealing all with nominal information here, of course, and other taxes and so forth. So looking at, all other components in general, basically driving them by all these consumer spending and investment categories and the current spending on the government. What else do we have? Your royalty equation. So here we're looking, you guys are obviously more the mining components driving that. So we're taking the raw material price index for metallic and non-metallic minerals there, converting it and applying it times your other primary GDP as your driver in that case. So a lot of stuff in here, just on and on and on. Basically every component of your economic accounts on the tax side. Capital cost allowances and more transfers and so forth. Finally ending up at your net lending position here. And we also, I believe we get your debt data out of, I'm not sure if this province, some of them we collect out of your budget publications, but this one might be coming from a different source. And then same stuff for the municipal side. Of course, the municipalities are they have all their spending components, transfers to persons, transfers to business, the provincial and your interest on debt. Is it your province that is allowing municipalities to borrow now, or is that Saskatchewan? You guys know about that?
I don't think they can, but I could be mistaken there.
Yeah, they made some rule changes in one of the prairie provinces. I couldn't remember. I just heard about this recently. So there is the possibility of going into debt now, which is very interesting, and just because of COVID, and they need to look at recovery stuff. So they've passed some legislation to allow that. I'm not sure how it's backed. I haven't read about it yet. Interesting stuff. Again, nonprofit institution transfers and the capital transfers. So all your expenditure components. And then on the revenue side, of course, a little bit more limited for the municipalities here. You just have your indirect taxes, getting all your, parking meters and all that kind of stuff. That's sort of, I think that's an other. I believe that one, other transfers. They all have their investment income and so on and so on. And then these are just transfers coming from the different levels of government. So you don't find them in this block because they are contained. They're actually G variables. So one thing I didn't mention here is, of course, a T variable is essentially a revenue variable for the government, and a G variable is an expenditure variable for the government sectors. So that's why these are in the revenue equation for the municipalities, is because these are expenditures from the feds, from the province and so forth, transferring money down to the municipal level. Anything else here? Okay, and we also have our CPP section, pretty straightforward. And finally, some government totals. So then we're back to these D-log equations. So we're taking the general consumption information out of the economic accounts and then trying to drive them like the federal, provincial, local and CPP levels of government, and so forth, on all the key expenditure and revenue side components. So you can dissect that later if you'd like. This section here that is all shut off, we should actually just delete that. We've been keeping it in here. It's just an old remnant. This was an old CO2 model built about 20 years ago. And it's, as you can see, it's completely inactive. We just have it in here because we, for some reason, like to keep it. So you can ignore that. Okay, but we're getting into the industry blocks. So most of these industry sectors they're largely identical. Not too much to say about them. So we can start with the ag as we get into them here. So first of all, for agriculture, we are modeling these two subsectors in this case. So we have the crop and animal products component, and then we have the support activities aspect of it as well. So in this case, the way this model is calibrated, we have what are called RX variables. So these are basically the trend growth assumptions that we set. And the way we do that is we're essentially looking, graphing this stuff historically and saying what is its potential, where could it go in the future. So when I look at this stuff for agriculture, for example, as you can see, it's up, down, up, down. 20 is a bad year, and then we're assuming recovery and so on. So that's these RX are sort of giving that general direction push. That's essentially what they are used for. So there are RX variables. These will be in the industry macro that I'll show you later, but they exist in every single export equation. Secondly, on the export side, we have that RTY GDP. So this is that trading partner weighted GDP growth that I showed you earlier in the rest of world section before lunch. So again, we're considering growth in the US, Japan, China, EU, that type of stuff. So obviously stronger growth implies typically larger trade. Then we also have a component here. This is where we're factoring in the cost model in this case. So we do take some moving averages on the raw material price index for agricultural products, and then we're taking an average as well on the costs, the localized costs, so that we're not getting too much of an impact here. And I think this is, Thomas, to your question there about passing costs on. You can adjust these moving average periods as well. To try to either dampen the impact from significant cost increases locally, so that it doesn't affect this equation too much. But as I was mentioning, what we do with these RXs, we typically put in update statements for the next, maybe for the first 2 years, it depends, just to really sort of guide where we think industries are going in terms of trade. So we basically go through every sector's exports and imports and try to make short-term assumptions about that stuff as well. So if you're going to have 50 industries, you need to look at all 50 industries for not only for exports, but also for imports to get your aggregate GDP impacts. So that's all worked into here as well. Imports equations are kind of essentially a reverse of the same thing. So here you're looking at the domestic sales, how much domestic demand is there for agricultural products. Again, they have an RIM variable, which this is the equivalent to your RX variables in the export equations, where we try to calibrate where imports could be going in the future. Again, they then react to differences between global prices and local costs. It's a cost competitiveness measure that we try to put into each one of these equations, so that you start changing prices, you start pushing up costs locally, you'll then typically import more in a higher cost situation, and or export more if you're becoming more competitive, of course. The idea being that your trading partners would then buy more from you. So that's really what the price and cost model is about here, trying to get some trade flavor built into the modeling system.
I have a question, more like a call. It would be nice if your software kind of worked with the equation file, almost like a nice front end to kind of go through these and then have it show you in real time, just like historical data that kind of coincides, so that when you select the equation, you could see the data without having to.
You mean graphically?
Yeah, yeah, some sort of like nice front end. So if you're looking at like a suggestion box to be into like future versions, something, because it seems like a real important thing to be able to walk through this. And
I
I've
agree.
watched this before, and I'm always like, now I want to like take like an equation and then start plotting like the variables and start getting the stuff out. But it would be nice if it was just all kind of there like right away. So if you select it, you kind of select a line and then it shows you like all the data, or if there's some sort of nesting or some sort of tree structure with this.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, I'll put this in the suggestion box, David.
yeah.
That's yeah, that would be fantastic. I agree.
No, so you're not in this like this glorified notepad.
Right. Yeah, I know. I'm not sure how to program that actually.
Yeah.
You
Sorry?
have to be some type of interactive text file, right?
Yeah, so you have the relationships of these variables, and then either drilling down or even just selecting one of these equations, and there's 8 variables, but you see all the data there right away, and you see how it is in history and how it.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll get some augmented reality stuff, and we can work on it like that as well. Get some VR headsets. I'm not sure.
Well,
I would love to do all these things. Yeah, we fantasize about that kind of stuff too.
Ain't nobody got time for that though. Yeah, sorry. Anyways.
No, I definitely agree with you though. I mean, you know, when we do that, this is a very lengthy process. Clearly, you know, you have to view all these variables right now, the state of things. But that would certainly be fantastic if we could do that kind of stuff. So moving on. Now, what this model really is, I'm not sure if you guys are all familiar with the concept of gross output. You don't typically hear too much about it in school or the term in your textbooks, but you know, GO, gross output, is essentially your price times your quantity. And then of course, when you apply a value added share to that gross output level, you get GDP. So that's how, which is of course the share of gross output that goes to capital and labor. That's your value added. So the way these models are set up here is we're computing gross output. Take a look at this equation here. So to compute the gross output historically, we take the StatCan GDP data. We assume that you get a fixed value added share historically. You then divide that GDP by value added to get your gross output level historically. Going forward, we then, because we have a major project system, whenever you see these MP variables, that's what we're doing here. So we have to take historical gross output, we subtract the projects from it because we do not want them included in this estimate. We want them accounted for independently, which they are over here at the front. So if you look at the brackets around this, we're then taking that, I guess you call base gross output, excluding projects, and then growing it with your domestic sales, less your imports, plus your exports. And then again, taking the major projects out of there. So that's basically your domestic demand, or sorry, your final demand numbers. So this is just taking current year over the lag on all the same variables. So that drives your gross output equation right there. You can then have projects modeled independently on top of that. And then when you take that gross output, it's the same concept for GDP. We have a fixed value added share that comes out of the input output tables. We multiply that times the gross output, excluding its projects, so the base level again, and then we would add in the GDP for all the major projects in agriculture as well. So that's essentially how we have structured an industry in this model. So they're all the same. Except for possibly some energy sectors we could be doing a bit differently. And the government sectors as well are modeled separately, which I'll show you when we get down to them. Employment, then, of course, is just taking same type of concept, GDP, take those projects out, divide it by the industry productivity. It gives you your employment level, because you call base employment excluding projects, and then we put in those project numbers on top of that independently as well. So a lot of this subtraction you see in these equations with anything with an MP, that's all that's trying to do. We're trying to isolate major projects so that we can model them separately, because we'll typically know the operational employment associated with those projects, or at least we're making assumptions about it in our project system. And we want to keep that separate, and so that it's not getting affected by any of these other factors here that are coming out of the model. So that basically allows you to put a project in for a shock, you know, and then you get your direct effect, direct operational impacts are accounted for separately, and then you get your spin-off effects generated by the model to give you a total multiplier. So it's really good for modeling economic impact studies and that kind of stuff using the project system, because it's isolated that way. So next we have the labor productivity equation. Again, same type of stuff. We're taking growth in GDP, taking out a moving average, so your productivity improves as you deviate from a more of an average level of growth. So when things are accelerating, productivity is picking up, and vice versa. We then have an aggregate, what we call the RPR ag. This is your productivity adjustment in the industry macro. Okay, just remove this off the screen. Okay, so now this is back to the domestic sales now. So this is what I was talking about earlier. So every industry has a domestic sales equation. Some of them are quite limited, as you can see. This is the shortest one there is on the support activities. But what this is how much does every other industry and final demand component demand of my industry, I will say in this case. So what kind of exposure do we have? So of course, if the agriculture sector picks up, it has demands on itself, right? So for every dollar increase in gross output, you're going to get 14.6 cents pickup in your domestic sales. And that's really the way to read this. So of course, you'll have significantly stronger coefficients on sectors that demand more inputs in general. So here's the chemical sector. You get a bit of, obviously, a larger coefficient, that kind of stuff. So that's all this is. This is your, and then at the bottom, I should show you, these are the final demand components. So the first part of these equations are all the same. They're in inter-industry trade, you could say, inter-industry demand components. And then the second part, whether you get all of them in here or not, is another issue, depending on if their coefficients are significant or not. You'll get the final demand categories. So if, you know, of course, if someone starts buying more motor vehicles, if we go to the manufacturing equation, you're going to see a large coefficient on CD in that case, right? The durable purchases, right? So that's the type of stuff that's built into these domestic sales equations. So these get into your, of course, back up to the top here, into your imports. They get into your gross output, sort of the leading factor here on where sales are going in a current year. Now we also look at, we create an expected sales growth assumption here, and this is really just to drive the investment equations a bit. And here it's taking a moving average on where the industry is going. So it basically says, as we're picking up, you tend to invest more. As we're slowing down, you'll get a bit of a slowdown in the investment. And so this into the investment equation here, that's where you get this expected sales growth component. You're also seeing the relative cost of capital built in here as well that I showed you earlier, where we also have the labor costs, which get into the productivity equation. Should have showed you that here. That was on the back end of the productivity equation, those RLCs. But back to this guy, your relative cost of capital. So of course, as capital becomes relatively more expensive, you're going to see a slowdown in investment, and vice versa. We then have our Z variables, the ones that I showed you earlier in the industry macro, and then we have depreciation rates. So these are held constant from the historical FKSF data. If you start having changes in these, you can affect the investment. This is a technological adjustment, so I believe it is set to 0 right now, but you can use this factor to assume that there's going to be technological change in an industry to help sort of offset either, reduce investment in that case or raise it, however you're going to set that. And put these all together, and you're basically looking at multiplying that times last year's stock. And again, taking out this major project component. So this we call the cumulative base stock in projects. We put a C in there because we have to account for that continual increase in capital stock from the project system, particularly when you're modeling multi-billion-dollar projects. As their capital comes online, you had $3-4 billion of additional capital. You do not want that going into this equation, because you start applying depreciation rates to that stock increase, and what's going to happen, obviously, your investment equation is going to go crazy. So instead, all the projects we're controlling for depreciation investment or sustaining investment for those projects individually, and that's done through the ongoing investment in major project variable here. And we can look at that again. We'll get into that tomorrow. Capital stock equations. So you have your stock last year, and then we have new investment, adding stock for the current year, taking your depreciation rate and basically eliminating some of the stock from last year. So if this is, say, 10%, for example, you're taking 10% of last year's stock out. This is the project stuff again, isolating that, and then putting the major project investment in, and also putting in the major project capital, ongoing capital, accounting for that separately. So, okay, the last component of an industry block is on the energy IO coefficients. So these are the ones that were in the cost equations earlier. So these are essentially, what is your input share, or how much does refined petroleum products make up of your industry's input? Whether that be 1%, it's typically quite low for most sectors, relatively low in the 1 to 2% range, if not lower than that. But then when you get to sectors like chemicals, energy inputs can rise up to about 15%. I think the chemical sector is one of the highest of any industry, so quite significant in that case. And what these equations are actually doing is assuming substitutability amongst the factors of or the energy products. So we call this model a CLEMS model, which is capital, labor. Your factors of production are capital, labor, energy, and raw materials, making up the CLEM. And on the energy component, that's where we're trying to isolate your refined petroleum products, and we're trying to isolate your natural gas usage, and we're trying to isolate your electric power usage here. So what these equations are doing, given that we put a 12-year moving average on them, it basically says that you're going to eventually substitute out energy products that are becoming too costly, and look at, and through that, these sum up, which would then raise your value added over time. So it's a complicated process, but the whole point is that as energy becomes more expensive, you try to substitute out for more productive capital. The non-energy material component stays constant. So these would actually decline, and you would have a higher value added share over time. So that is where additional GDP or returns for capital earners, or labor for that matter, would see an increase in GDP. So that's basically what's happening here. So these are all just relative cost equations looking at, so you'll notice this is the refined petroleum products in this case. Refined petroleum products do not show up on the right-hand side of this equation, whereas they do show up right here on this side of things, where you're actually factoring in the price of this relative to other things. So it's really just it's about substituting amongst different energy products based on relative prices amongst those products. and factoring in your energy usage input of that in your production process. So it's a complicated issue, but that's really what you're getting through these equations here. And it's
Aaron,
all built
can
in.
I ask a related question?
Sure, of course.
Does the model have an energy supply and demand module to it? Especially as you're kind of forecasting further out into the future.
Yes, it does. I mean, quick answer. If you were to apply these energy input shares and sum them up, right? Apply the energy input required times gross output, for example, and then sum them all up, you would have an energy demand concept for refined fuels, petroleum and coal or gas or whatever, but it would be in a dollar form, right? It would be in a base year dollar form. So you could then apply a base year energy price. Refined petroleum products is complicated because it's a blend, right? You have gasoline, aviation fuel, heating oil, all kinds of stuff built into this one. But on the natural gas and the electric power, that's much more direct. You could definitely get an estimate out of this system, and that's kind of why we built it as well. Fortunately, we can't differentiate the refined petroleum products, though. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so that's an industry block for you. I mean, they're largely all similar. There are different types of trade equations, very slightly different ones. And that's, I'll show you, here's a good example of one right here. So we're in cases where you do not have a commodity price. For example, we don't have a commodity price for fishing, hunting, and trapping, right? In this case, for the exports, but we do have the forestry version. In this case, so we can at least use the wood product as a driving factor here. So you get these different types of it. We call it a type A and a type B trade equation. And in this case, you're looking at relative cost competitiveness compared to trading partner inflation in this case, and using that trade weighted exchange rate. So that's the best we can do for sectors where there is no global price in that case. So hopefully you can see the difference here between the two, where many of the, they're more, I guess you could say, less important sectors, less trade directed sectors that do not have that price in there. So this is the alternative equation that's being used for it. But other than that, rather than going through every single industry block, they're generally the same. You do get some differences. Sometimes we model oil and gas more specifically. We would use the CAP production forecast in that case to try and see where GDP is going on conventional oil production for Manitoba. So but again, not a major sector for you guys, but we do model really just the energy sectors exogenously using different drivers. And you can see here we have a note. We actually use this one for the National Energy Board. We did some stuff for them where we would actually, they give us the production schedule in that case, and then you could just exogenize the numbers. So there's different methods being used here, but most sectors are generally the same. As we go down here, all have their domestic sales equations, their exports, their imports, investment, expected sales growth, capital stock, and then their energy input shares, allowing for substitutability. Now, in some sectors, we don't allow any substitutability, and you'll see it more in I guess the petroleum and coal would have that, and some of the oil and gas industries. And that's because the production process, it doesn't allow them to substitute energy types out, right? I mean, if you're refining oil, for example, you need the same amount of oil no matter what, of course, to come out with a liter of gasoline. So there are some exceptions here. I think we do the same thing on the utilities side here. So here's the electric power and the other utilities. we assume there's no substitutability for some of these sectors. So they are flatlined going forward and have a constant energy input share in their production. Okay, so if I move ahead, actually one thing that I should show you is the construction industry. Yeah, so what we've done with the construction sector is we've shut off the domestic sales equations computed from the input-output framework. And that's because we have such a detailed investment sector in this model. So you can see that the residential construction domestic sales is driven by our residential construction investment, excluding transaction costs in that case. The non-residential construction is driven by the buildings, investment in building construction. So that's that asset class I showed you earlier. And then on the engineering side of construction, domestic sales are driven by the engineering construction investment. And then on the repair component, this is where we're putting in that maintenance and repair data. So this is the residential maintenance, and that's the non-residential maintenance stuff. Really just to get these domestic sales numbers right, which can then drive gross output for the 4 components of construction, and then drive GDP, and ultimately will drive their employment numbers. So that's the only place where the domestic sales is not using IO coefficients in any way. So you can see the manufacturing industry. We have a lot more prices, of course, producer price indices, driving the trade equations here, and quite a bit of detail. Quite a few sectors there, as you can see, where we're modeling exports, imports, GDP, gross output. There's a lot of stuff to look at there. And a lot of isolation. You can do a lot of modeling if your sectors are picking up, or you start to get maybe a project, that kind of stuff with this model.
So it's a dumb question. When you say exports and imports in this, is that combined interprovincial and international?
It is, correct.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, we can't, well, we could. Computing this stuff on an industry basis, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the data, David. We have to take commodity space data and convert it into industry space.
Okay.
Right. They do not publish industry-based exports and imports. Statistics Canada does not do that. So we take the commodity data because that's how things are provided in this country. And this is the same thing that any government or even StatsCan does themselves when they have to do this. You have to take it, you have to use the input-output framework, and then you have to convert it into an industry space based on the output matrix. So it's a lengthy process, but we have a system that does it on the side and builds this data out for us. I think we get it every June or something like that. So we get another year, and it's highly lagged, right? I think we just got the 2017 numbers past few months, I think, because the COVID did cause some delays this year in its release. So this type of stuff, the trade data by industry has to be sort of tuned in the past couple of years because it's so many years behind GDP for that reason. So what we try to do is just sort of bring it up or down in line with the GDP data, assuming that they did get more sales or not. So that type of stuff is done. It's a process that we do each year here. But basically, what I'm getting at is that you can't just look this stuff up. There's nothing comparable. But we have been provided some special data a few times, and we come up with pretty much the exact same numbers as everyone else. So we were definitely concerned that we were possibly not doing it right, but we clearly are. So it is a relatively straightforward process. It's just complicated to do.
Good to know then. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
No problem. Okay, I'm just going to move ahead here, see if there's anything else I can. I'll just look at, just to give you the example of the government sectors. So owner occupied, a very tiny little industry here. We just run it off of the imputed rent numbers, the GDP. That's why we isolated that, the consumption of services, imputed rent services. So we just take last value and grow it like those numbers, those estimates.
Yeah, we get the gross output of the owner occupied in, we'll get a number in May, and that just goes like directly in.
Okay.
Straight counts, yeah.
Yeah, you can just exclude it from the
It's like
solution.
it's like a one-to-one.
Okay. No problem. Almost there. Okay, yeah, the only thing I was going to show you here on the health side, health, education, government services, was how GDP is computed right here. So again, as I said, current operational spending by the government is typically wages and salaries. Therefore, we take GDP and grow its last value like the growth in your current spending. So, and these are tuned as per the budget information that we have access to. So you can always adjust these if you want GDP to grow faster or slower in the public sectors based on these current spending numbers. And then the jobs, of course, can be affected by productivity adjustments. Okay. And then at the bottom here, after you get past accommodation and food, you get all those miscellaneous categories of GDP. The ones they can't allocate: operating office, cafeteria, and laboratory supplies, travel, entertainment, advertising and promotion. We had to put these in here, but and transportation margins, things where they just have no ability to allocate them to an industry. And then finally, we have our nonprofit institutions, GDP, or growth. We're only looking at gross output in this case. And total exports. So what we actually do here, all those industry exports that we've generated, we sum them up here, and we call them XX. And that is, the concept is we basically call them synthetic exports, right? Because XX, it's close, which says we're doing a pretty good job, but it's not identical to your economic account export data. So if I show you, if we go look at some of these. So when you take the commodity space data and convert it, see, it's a pretty good fit. So the red line, or sorry, the black line is your PEA, your provincial economic account information. 18 was last actual in this data that we're looking at right now, so right here. And this is when you take the commodity space data and then break it apart across the industries. So you do get some reasonable representation in the direction and so forth, as you can see.
So the differences will just get put back into the actual, like the final estimate then from your.
Okay, what we do. So again, this is kind of like the Chain Fisher problem as well. Doesn't add up. So we grow the PEA export data like the synthetic.
Okay.
That's what's happening here. It's the only way to do it on an industry basis, and drive your demand side equations. But I mean, of course, it absolutely does work here. Start playing with raising exports in a sector, you're going to get changes in your on the demand side of the model as well, which will then cycle around into your domestic sales equations and have feedback effects across every industry. And exact same concept for the imports. So we call them computed or synthetic imports. They drive the PEA data as well. And then we get our nominal component using the deflators, of course. Okay. These are just some other intellectual property categories and some other components that we calculate down at the bottom here. You can largely ignore this stuff. Okay, and then the very last section of the model file here is the greenhouse gas model. This is our emissions model. So we take this stuff from Environment Canada. I think right now we have up to 2018 on this data, so I'm not sure how much you guys are into carbon tax revenue modeling or anything like that. But we do have emission estimates by sector here, and you can look at that if you're curious using these emissions tables. So one of them, I think emissions 1, just does it on I think it's on a 2-digit NAIC basis. So these are our megatons, our millions of metric tons of emissions data. So if you look at the Environment Canada data, this is what you guys are producing, almost 22 million tons. I believe I have that number right. And then you can look at who's making all the emissions here. And of course, a lot of methane coming out of your ag sector, significant amount of stuff there. Transportation and warehousing, another big component, of course. And very relatively smaller parts for other sectors, but of course manufacturing, you guys have at least had the primary metals, so this may be off a bit, but after the Thompson shutdown, but we'll have to look at that. But the idea is we had to integrate this stuff to try and do some carbon tax modeling for the provincial governments, so we integrated this into the model as well. And I guess the gist of this model is that essentially we're making the assumption that emissions in a sector grow like gross output. So here you take GDP divided by value added. That's your definition of gross output. So we take the D log of that. That is the primary driver. All these secondary components of this equation, these are the emission factors. They do not change. All this is how many units of carbon you get out of a unit of natural burning an MMBTU of gas. How much carbon do you get? Or sorry, this is the CO2. This is your CH4 and your N2O, your sulfur and so forth. So it's just these come from the I think I can't remember. I think it's the United Nations stuff that we collect, and they never change. You still get the same number of carbon out of burning a unit of oil as you always have. And then we look at energy. We apply these energy use shares as well, so you get some substitutability there. But it's a very slow process with those 12-year moving averages on those equations, and so forth. But the idea here was ultimately we're still working on this, but we wanted to allow for basically technological improvements and so forth. That in a true emissions model that they have nowadays. You make assumptions that you get industrial processes that are more efficient. You get scrubbers put on your smokestacks, things like that can sort of extract the carbon out of for every unit of output out of the system. So that's something you can do with these Z variables for now. We haven't really taken the model much further than that, but some people that use these models, or at least this emissions model, in more detail are working on things like this and making assumptions for that type of stuff. If you're a real hardcore carbon revenue modeler, that is, and you are into also an industry economist along with that. So these are built into the system. If you ever wanted to see what your emissions are like by sector, it's all built in here. And that is the end of the model, summing them all up for an aggregate emissions number. So a lot of information.
But it's all on tape, so it's good.
That's right.
Put a lot of Post-it notes at each bookmarks.
Exactly.
Each point you could jump to.
Yeah. No, you could edit edit this thing up, put all kinds of comments everywhere, and write stories about every single equation if you like.
There's got to be a program that takes audio, then converts it into captions, and then takes the captions and puts it into text. So right there, we have the
software business, David. Got great ideas.
Always thinking ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's these glasses are just, I don't know, I feel smarter for some reason.
Anyways, okay, so I probably worn you guys out now with the model, and I think we blew it right past our break we were going to take. So you guys want to take 15 minutes, think about some of this stuff, and we can come back, talk about any other stuff, and then we can move on to some other using the system, hopefully, next.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah, I think we have a lot of time for tomorrow as well. So you guys can let me know how you're feeling. If you're completely mentally worn out, whether we stop early or what we do here. So it's up to you. But for now, let's take a little 15-minute break, and I'll see you guys in 15.
Sounds good.
Sure.
Thanks,
Okay.
Aaron.